Once, he was England's golden monarch, a man of power, charm, and unshakable pride. King Henry VIII had ruled through fear and desire, reshaping his kingdom to satisfy his will. But as the years passed, that strength became his prison. The same king who had conquered hearts and defied the church would spend his final days trapped inside a body that betrayed him, surrounded by whispers of death and the stench of rotting flesh. By the mid-1540s, Henry was no longer the towering figure who had dazzled Europe. The athletic young ruler who once rode horses for hours now struggled to walk across a room. Decades of indulgence, banquets of roasted meats, flagons of ale, endless feasts had swollen his frame to nearly 400 pounds. Beneath layers of silk and ermine, his legs were riddled with ulcers so deep that pus seeped through the bandages. Courtiers could smell the infection before they saw the king. Doctors tried everything: leeches, herbal poultices, even cauterization, but nothing stopped the decay. The once majestic Tudor monarch now screamed through the night, his chambers echoing with pain and rage. He blamed his servants, cursed his physicians, and refused to believe his strength was fading. To the court, the King of England had become something terrifying, a dying god who could still destroy anyone who angered him. But behind those locked doors, even Henry's closest attendants feared to breathe too loudly. No one dared tell him that his wounds would not heal. Some whispered that divine punishment had begun, that the same man who tore England from the Pope, who beheaded wives and advisors, was now being devoured by his own sins. Yet none dared speak it aloud. As his condition worsened, Henry became paranoid. He ordered double guards at his chambers and demanded that every message be sealed in his presence. He believed everyone was plotting against him, even his own family. Night after night, he would summon ministers only to accuse them of treason, then send them away trembling, uncertain if they would see dawn. Still, he refused to face death. He ordered his armor to be polished and his tapestries changed, as if pretending could make him immortal. But his reflection in the mirror told another story: a swollen face, blackened legs, eyes dulled by pain and fury. And soon, even his mirror would not recognize the king who looked back. Because as Henry's body rotted, something far more dangerous began to rot inside his court. By the winter of 1546, Whitehall Palace had become a fortress of secrets. The once lively court of King Henry VIII was now a place where whispers could mean execution and silence could mean survival. Servants moved quietly through the endless corridors, avoiding the gaze of the king's guards. Every step was careful, every word measured, for everyone knew that the dying king's temper was as deadly as his disease. Henry's illness had not only eaten through his body, it had corroded his mind. The ulcers on his legs oozed constantly, leaving stains on his sheets and trails of decay that even the palace maids dreaded to clean. The smell was unbearable, yet the king insisted on grand feasts, music, and ceremony, as if forcing life to obey him one last time. The courtiers, pale with fear, clapped and laughed on command, praying he wouldn't notice their disgust. But beneath the music, another battle was raging, one for the future of England. As the king's health crumbled, his advisors began to form secret alliances. The great factions of the court, the conservative Catholics and the reformist Protestants, both knew that the moment Henry died, chaos could swallow the kingdom. Whoever controlled the young prince, Edward, would control the throne. And so, as the king lay dying upstairs, his ministers downstairs plotted in silence. Among them was Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, Henry's brother-in-law, a man of ambition and cold calculation. He saw the king's decline as both tragedy and opportunity. He and his allies began to forge documents, manipulate council members, and secure loyalty oaths in anticipation of Henry's final breath. Meanwhile, others, like Bishop Gardiner and the Catholic faction, hoped for a return to Rome's influence once the tyrant fell. The king, though bedridden, sensed the shifting tides. His paranoia deepened. He accused his courtiers of poisoning his food and secretly testing his will. At night, he demanded his guards to check the door locks twice. Sometimes he'd scream into the darkness, calling for his dead wives, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Catherine Howard, as if they were haunting him. The once mighty monarch, who'd commanded armies and reshaped faith, now feared the shadows of his own making. Even the bravest nobles lowered their eyes, afraid one wrong glance could mean the block. Every hour felt like walking on the edge of a blade. And deep within that suffocating palace, one truth began to spread quietly. The king was dying, and with him, the world as they knew it. Because in the dying breath of a tyrant, every man must decide loyalty or survival. The closer death came, the more monstrous Henry became. The disease that ravaged his body seemed to feed on his fury. He lashed out at anyone who dared show pity: doctors, servants, even his most trusted advisors. To the outside world, England's mighty king still ruled with divine authority. But behind the gilded doors of Whitehall, those who served him whispered that the king had become something less than human, a living corpse wrapped in gold. His legs had swollen to twice their size. The ulcers festered with infection, oozing a stench so vile that visitors often gagged as they entered the room. One ambassador recorded that His Majesty's body is swollen, his flesh decayed, and his temper most dreadful. Even touching him was dangerous. One physician fainted during a treatment, overcome by the smell of death. But the king refused to be seen as weak. When he could no longer ride or walk, he demanded to be carried on an elaborate chair of iron and velvet so heavy it took 6 men to move. He still wore rich robes and jewels, forcing the image of majesty while his body betrayed him. During audiences, he shouted at ministers, his face purple with rage, as his ulcers bled beneath the fabric. The same man who once danced and jousted now sat motionless, glaring, drunk on pain and pride. Some courtiers claimed that when he screamed in agony, the chandeliers trembled. Others believed he was cursed, that the spirits of the wives he executed were finally claiming their vengeance. The more his body failed, the more brutal his commands became. Old friends vanished overnight. Servants disappeared without reason. One wrong word, one look of disgust, and a man could be gone by morning. Henry's once brilliant mind, the scholar who had written against Martin Luther, now drifted into madness. He ordered the arrest of his longtime ally, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and even signed a death warrant against the Duke's son, all while his own life hung by a thread. But the king's cruelty masked something deeper: terror. He was haunted not only by the ghosts of those he'd killed, but by the realization that power could not protect him from decay. At night, he refused to sleep without torches burning. He said the darkness smelled of death, and soon that smell would no longer just haunt his nights. It would become the mark of his final days. Because the King of England, once feared by all, was about to face the one enemy he could not command: his own flesh. By late December 1546, the palace floors trembled under the weight of fear and ambition. Everyone at court knew Henry VIII was dying, but no one dared speak it aloud. Outside his chambers, nobles argued in hushed tones over who would control the future. Inside, the king lay surrounded by doctors, sweating through fevered dreams, his breath thick with infection. The once unstoppable monarch now spent his final strength not fighting death, but deciding who would inherit the world he had shattered. Henry had changed England forever, breaking from the Pope, seizing monasteries, rewriting faith itself. But now, as his body failed, his empire stood on the edge of chaos. His only son, Edward, was just 9 years old, far too young to rule. So in those final weeks, the king's chamber became a battlefield of paper and ink. Factions clawed for power through signatures, seals, and forged loyalties. From his sickbed, Henry dictated revisions to his will. He named Prince Edward as heir, followed by his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, but the true power would belong to those chosen to guide the boy king. The names written in that document would shape England's destiny for decades. Yet the king's mind drifted between lucidity and delirium. He often forgot who was in the room. Some whispered that his ministers took advantage of his weakness, slipping names into the final will he never approved. The Duke of Somerset, Edward Seymour, waited like a shadow at the edge of the royal bed. He was calm, patient, and ruthless. His allies among the Protestant faction saw him as England's next ruler in all but name. Across the palace, the Catholic faction, led by Bishop Gardiner, plotted their own survival. Both sides watched the king's failing breath, knowing that a single hour could change everything. Henry's temper remained ferocious. When a physician suggested he confess his sins before death, the king glared and roared, "I am not yet dead." Then, in a rare moment of silence, He whispered, "Bring me my will." He pressed his trembling hand to the parchment, sealing it with his dying strength, though no one could say for certain what he had truly read or understood. When he finally dropped the pen, the court bowed, pretending not to see the shaking hand that had once signed death warrants with ease. Outside, snow fell softly on the Thames, muffling the city's noise. Inside, power was already shifting, and the men who pretended to mourn the king were sharpening their knives for what came next. Because in the shadow of his death, Henry's final act was not peace. It was a curse on those who would inherit his crown. January 1547. London was frozen in silence. Snow coated the rooftops of Whitehall Palace, and torches burned low in the corridors. Inside the royal bedchamber, the most powerful man in England lay dying, his body swollen. His breath labored, his eyes dull and gray. King Henry VIII, once a symbol of unstoppable power, now struggled to stay conscious, trapped inside a body that refused to obey him. By this point, his legs were black with infection. His attendants had to wrap them daily in cloths soaked with wine to dull the stench. The ulcers had burrowed deep into the flesh, and the pus never stopped flowing. His face was pale and bloated, his once golden beard now streaked with gray and sweat. The air in the room was thick, a mix of rotting flesh and candle smoke, yet the courtiers knelt by his bed, pretending not to notice the smell of death itself. The doctors knew he wouldn't last much longer. His pulse faltered, his body trembled, and his voice grew faint.
Ow.
But no one dared tell him he was dying.
Yes.
In Tudor England, to speak the king's death aloud before it happened was treason. So they told him lies instead, that his color was improving, that his wounds were closing, that the warmth in the air was life returning. He listened, eyes half closed, as if he already knew the truth. On the night of January 27th, Henry called for Archbishop Cranmer, the one man he still trusted. The archbishop was summoned at once, but by the time he arrived, the king could no longer speak. Cranmer knelt beside the bed and whispered prayers into the silence. He asked the king to make a sign that he trusted in God's mercy. Slowly, Henry's swollen fingers tightened around his hand. Then, without a word, they loosened. The chamber fell still. The candles flickered as if the palace itself exhaled. Outside, the guards continued their watch, unaware that England's most feared ruler had just drawn his last breath. But his death was kept secret. The court could not risk panic or rebellion. For 2 days, the news was hidden while the council prepared to seize control. Food was served, bells were silenced, and courtiers went about their duties as if nothing had changed. Behind locked doors, the new king's name, Edward VI, was whispered, rehearsed, and prepared for public announcement. When the truth finally reached the people, it came not as mourning, but as relief. After 37 years of rule, Henry VIII was dead. But his death brought no peace, because the horrors that consumed his final days were only the beginning of England's reckoning with his sins. When King Henry VIII finally died, England didn't just lose a ruler, it inherited a rotting problem. Its massive corpse, swollen from disease and decay, was too large for a normal coffin. The royal carpenters had to build an enormous lined casket, layered with perfumes and herbs to mask the stench. But even lead couldn't contain what was coming. The body was sealed inside with quicklime, a powder once used to speed decomposition. Yet instead of purifying the air, the chemical reaction made the corpse swell further. As the temperature inside the coffin rose, gas built up beneath the royal flesh. And within days, whispers spread through Whitehall that something foul was leaking through the cracks. When the coffin was loaded onto a wagon for its final journey to Windsor Castle, the air around it grew unbearable. Guards followed at a distance, covering their faces with scented cloths. But the most disturbing moment came at St. George's Church in Sion Abbey, where the coffin was left overnight, according to one account, the next morning. The priests discovered a dark stain on the stone floor beneath the casket, a pool of black liquid that had leaked out during the night. The smell was overwhelming. Some witnesses claimed dogs entered the church and began licking at the blood-like fluid seeping from the coffin seams. To the superstitious, it was divine punishment, a sign that the king, who had destroyed so many monasteries, was being consumed by his own sins. The image horrified the clergy. They ordered the floor scrubbed clean and burned incense until the scent faded. But the story spread through London like wildfire. The king's body burst, the dogs drank his blood. It was said in whispers, sung in taverns, and written in secret letters. Henry VIII, once feared by all, had become a cautionary tale of corruption and divine justice. When the coffin finally reached Windsor, the burial was rushed. There were no grand ceremonies, no great processions, like the ones he had once demanded for others. Guards lowered the bloated coffin into the vault beneath St. George's Chapel, directly beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he had ever claimed to love. There, in the cold stone tomb, the man who had defied the church and declared himself God's chosen ruler was left to rot beside the woman who had given him a son. For years, no one dared open the vault again. But rumors persisted that even in death, Henry's spirit haunted the castle, that footsteps echoed at night, and a heavy presence lingered near the chapel doors. It was as if the king's soul refused to rest, trapped between glory and guilt. After Henry VIII's death, the kingdom he built began to unravel slowly, painfully, almost poetically. His son, the frail Edward VI, inherited not just a throne, but a curse. The young boy, barely 9 years old, was crowned king, but his body was already weak from sickness. Those who had once bowed to his father now used the child as a puppet, fighting among themselves for control. Edward watched England crumble under his father's shadow. The Reformation, which Henry had forced upon the land, had left wounds that would not heal. Monasteries stood in ruins. Thousands of monks and nuns had been cast into poverty. The wealth Henry had stolen from the church was gone, spent on war, luxury, and vanity. By the time Edward fell ill with tuberculosis at age 15, many whispered that it was divine revenge, that the sins of the father had passed to the son. He died coughing blood, terrified and alone, just as his father had. But the curse didn't stop there. After Edward's death came Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter, the child of Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had cast aside. Mary grew up hating everything her father had done, especially his destruction of the Catholic Church. So, when she took the throne, she vowed to undo it all. Her reign became one of fire and blood. Thousands of Protestants were burned alive at the stake under her rule. The smell of death returned to the streets of London, this time not from a rotting king, but from human pyres. People called her Bloody Mary. Ironically, her cruelty mirrored her father's, proving that the same darkness that had ruled his heart now ruled hers. And then, when Mary died, Elizabeth I, Henry's second daughter, the one he had nearly executed, took the throne. She restored Protestantism and ushered in what history calls the Golden Age of England. But behind the glory of her reign was silence. Elizabeth never married, never bore children. The Tudor bloodline, once the most powerful in Europe, ended with her. The great dynasty that Henry VIII had sacrificed everything to create wives, friends, faith, died with his last daughter. No heirs, no legacy, only ghosts. For centuries, historians would argue over Henry's life. Was he a visionary or a monster drunk on power? But one thing remained certain. Every drop of blood he spilled, every cruel decision he made, came back to him through his descendants. Even in death, his kingdom carried his curse. Centuries passed, and King Henry VIII's tomb remained sealed beneath the stone floor of St. George's Chapel at Windsor.
Ow.
There was no grand monument, no towering marble effigy like other kings had. His burial vault was simple, almost forgotten, a quiet resting place for a man whose life had shaken the foundations of Europe. But silence didn't mean peace. Over the years, whispers grew that strange noises echoed beneath the chapel. Guards spoke of hearing footsteps when the church was empty, the slow, dragging sound of a heavy body moving across the stone. Some said they had seen a figure in royal robes standing by Jane Seymour's grave, his face pale, his eyes hollow. By the 19th century, curiosity about the hidden vault began to rise. When workers were restoring the chapel in 1813, they accidentally broke into a forgotten section of the royal crypt. What they found shocked them. Inside the dim chamber lay several coffins stacked unevenly among them, the remains of King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. The lead casing of Henry's coffin was dented and cracked as if pressure from within had forced it outward. The once grand coffin was marked only by a simple inscription, barely legible. There was no sign of the wealth or majesty one would expect from a man who had called himself the defender of the faith. One witness described the sight as a grotesque mockery of power, the bones of a tyrant left to rot beside the woman who died to please him. Others said the air in the chamber felt heavy, almost alive, as though the king's fury still lingered there. Later, when Queen Victoria visited Windsor, she ordered the site to be sealed again. She believed disturbing Henry's grave would invite the anger of the past. Since then, no one has opened the vault. The king remains entombed, his massive coffin resting beside Jane's, his sins buried but never forgotten. Today, tourists walk above his resting place without realizing they are standing over one of history's most infamous rulers. The marble slab covering his tomb bears no mention of his wives, his cruelty, or his madness, only his name, etched in silence. Yet the truth of his final days, the agony of his death, and the horror of his decaying body remain like an unspoken shadow beneath that sacred floor. It's as though England itself wanted to forget him, to bury not just the man but the monster he became. But history doesn't forget. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks of stone. Today, the story of King Henry VIII is often told in classrooms as a tale of power, politics, and 6 unfortunate wives. But the truth history tried to bury, is far darker. Henry's reign wasn't just a turning point for England. It was the birth of a system built on fear, blood, and the destruction of everything sacred. When Henry broke from the Catholic Church, it wasn't only to marry Anne Boleyn, it was to make himself divine. He dissolved monasteries, looted their treasures, and ordered holy relics destroyed. Thousands of monks and nuns who had dedicated their lives to faith were cast into the streets. Churches were stripped bare, ancient tombs desecrated. In the king's name, England erased centuries of spiritual history, and yet in the end, the same man who called himself God's chosen ruler died surrounded by darkness, abandoned, rotting, and afraid. His body betrayed him just as he had betrayed everyone around him. The Lion of England had become a monster trapped in his own decaying flesh. So even his legacy, which he had fought so hard to secure, turned to dust. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, inherited a kingdom soaked in blood. His only son died young. The Tudor name, which had once terrified Europe, ended with silence. But Henry's shadow never truly left. The Church of England he created still exists. The ruins of the monasteries he destroyed still stand across the countryside, haunting reminders of what his ambition cost. Every stone, every shattered statue, whispers of the same truth that power gained through fear always consumes the one who wields it. In 1547, as the last breath left his swollen body, Henry whispered for forgiveness, but no one knows if he found it. His priests fled the room. Case's courtiers avoided his gaze. And as the candlelight dimmed, England's most powerful man died, terrified of the judgment waiting beyond the grave.
I'll even know.
Nearly 5 centuries later, his ghost lingers in legend. At Windsor Castle, visitors claim to hear the sound of dragging footsteps echoing through the halls late at night. Some say it's Henry himself, still searching for peace. Others say it's a warning, a reminder that no throne, no crown, and no kingdom can protect a man from the weight of his own sins. The horrific final days of King Henry VIII weren't just the end of a ruler. They were the beginning of a curse that outlived his bloodline. A curse born from arrogance, cruelty, and the belief that even God could be replaced. And though England buried his body, the truth they tried to forget still bleeds through the walls of history.